The lie came easiest the moment I stopped calling it one. I buried the name Marlo Kane the day I signed my application as Marlo Voss, and I told myself the woman I used to be was dead enough that it wasn't perjury, only a burial. By the time the Ice Duchess of Draven Cove learned exactly who I was, we had already bled for each other, and there was no version of the truth that could send me back to who I'd been before her. The lobby of Draven Cove Holdings smelled like money trying to smell like nothing at all. Cold marble, filtered air, orchids replaced before they had the decency to wilt. I stood in line behind 11 other applicants for a junior protection contract nobody wanted, my resume trimmed down to almost nothing. 3 years of my real life folded into a shoebox under Nadia's bed. My hands didn't shake. They never shook. That was the one thing that had never stopped being true. The recruiter barely looked up. "Omega," he said, tapping my file like it was an apology he owed someone else. "Clients on this tier want alphas at the door." "Optics," he said, optics the way people say allergic. I said I understood. I did not say that I had once cleared a stairwell in 4 seconds flat while carrying a bleeding man twice my weight, because the woman who had done that didn't exist on paper anymore. 29 days of rent left. 1 good coat. A compass in my pocket with a needle that had stuck on the wrong direction for 3 years, ever since the night I stopped trusting where it pointed. Before I go back to how I ended up guarding the coldest woman in the city, there's something I need to ask you. If a story like this one is finding you, do something small for me right now and subscribe to the channel so you never miss where it goes next. The scuffle started behind me before the recruiter finished his sentence. A courier shoved a security guard. A canister rolled. Someone shouted a word that made 3 men near the elevators go still in the particular way men go still right before they do something stupid. I didn't decide to move. My body decided for me, the way it always had, ever since my father taught me that hesitation was the only sin a protector couldn't survive. I had the courier's wrist pinned and the canister capped before the recruiter's coffee hit the floor. 4 seconds. I counted all of them, out of habit, the way I counted everything. The lobby went quiet in that particular hush that follows violence nobody expected. A man in a gray suit stepped out of the crowd, studying me the way you'd study a knife you found in the wrong drawer. "Name," he said. "Marlo Voss." "Where'd you train?" "Nowhere you'd have heard of." It wasn't a lie. Nobody in this building would have heard of a program that no longer officially existed, run by a man whose grave I had never visited because I couldn't afford the flight. He didn't smile. Men like him rarely did. "Garrison Hale," he said. "Head of household security for Ms. Draven." He looked at my file, then at me, then back at the file like the two didn't belong in the same building. "You're not what we advertised for." "No," I agreed. "I'm better." He didn't laugh, but something in his jaw eased half a degree. The smallest concession a man like that was capable of making to a stranger. "The principal wants to meet every finalist herself. Personally, first time she's done that in 6 years. He said it like a warning, not an invitation. Don't waste her time. She doesn't give second look, second chances, second anything. The elevator climbed 31 floors in silence, broken only by the hush of recycled air and my own pulse counting seconds against my ribs. I'd read everything public about Isolde Draven, the youngest heir to a maritime empire that moved half a continent's cargo, orphaned into ownership before she was old enough to legally drink, cold enough that 3 separate business journalists had used the word glacial in headlines within the same year. What wasn't public was smaller and older and mine alone, that 7 years ago, on a pier that smelled like diesel and low tide, a woman named Rosalind Draven had died in an attack that also took the only family I had left, and that the official report had quietly, permanently blamed my father for it. I had told myself I was here for the paycheck. I had told myself a great many things to get through that door. The doors opened on the top floor onto a room with more window than wall, gray water stretching to a horizon the color of a bruise healing. A woman stood at the glass with her back to the room, dressed like a blade, dark hair pinned with military precision, and even from across 40 feet of marble I caught it. Vetiver and struck flint, cold and exact, a scent that didn't so much fill a room as claim it. She turned, and her eyes did the thing eyes do when they're deciding, in under a second, exactly how much you're worth. Miss Voss, her voice had no warmth in it to spare, and no need to raise itself. Garrison tells me you disabled an armed man in 4 seconds without breaking his wrist. That's either very good training or a very good lie. It's not a lie. Everyone says that. She crossed the room the way water finds the lowest point, without appearing to hurry. Up close her eyes were the gray of a coastline in November, and something in them looked older than the rest of her face, like grief that had learned to wear a very good suit. I've had 4 bodyguards in 3 years. 2 quit. 1 sold information to a tabloid. 1 I fired myself for flinching at the wrong moment. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I felt the cold rolling off her like weather. Tell me why I shouldn't assume you're the same disappointment in different shoes. I thought of my father's voice, low and certain, teaching a 9-year-old with skinned knees how to read a room for exits before she could read a menu for prices. I thought of the compass in my pocket, stuck on a direction I no longer trusted. I looked at Isolde Dravin, and I did the thing I had promised myself I would never do again. Not after the pier, not after the hearing, not after they took my father's name and turned it into a verdict. I offered myself to her, whole and unnamed, and I did not blink. Because I don't flinch, I said. Try me. She studied me a moment longer than the silence was comfortable for, and something moved behind her eyes that I wouldn't understand the shape of for months. Monday, she said finally. 6 a.m. Don't be late, Miss Voss. I don't repeat myself, and I don't forgive people who make me start over. She turned back to the window before I'd finished nodding, already finished with me, already looking at the gray water like it owed her an answer nobody else could give. I rode the elevator down 31 floors, with my heart, doing something it hadn't done in 3 years, and I told myself it was adrenaline. I told myself a great many things that week. Almost none of them were true. Monday came with rain that smelled like the harbor, and I arrived at the Draven estate 40 minutes early, because arriving on time had gotten my father killed once, and I had sworn never to test that particular lesson twice. The gate guard checked my credentials against a list, found my name, my false name, Voss, clean and empty, and mine only by paperwork, and waved me through iron gates flanked by camera housings I could have picked apart blindfolded. The house itself sat on a bluff over the water, gray stone against gray sky, built by a family who had never once in 3 generations doubted their right to the view. Garrison Hale met me in the security office, a converted carriage house lined with monitors, and handed me a tablet with more restrictions on it than I'd seen on some classified briefings. Perimeter rotations, comms protocol, threat tier assessments, he said, tapping through screens too fast for anyone unfamiliar to follow. I followed anyway. His eyes flicked to me once, twice, the second time lingering. You read that faster than anyone I've trained in 11 years. I'm a fast reader. He didn't believe me. I could see the doubt sitting behind his eyes like a held breath, but he didn't push it, not yet, filing it away the way careful men file away everything that doesn't add up until the day it finally does. Threat profiles elevated this quarter. Ms. Draven's cousin contested the succession clause in her father's will. Board vote in 6 weeks decides whether she keeps controlling shares or splits them with him. He said the name like it left a residue. Vane Draven. Charming, in the way a knife is charming right up until you're holding the blade end. I filed that away too, the way I filed everything, into the part of my mind that had once tracked 12 variables at once on a pier that ended badly for everyone I loved. She doesn't trust easily, Garrison added, and for the first time something almost gentle crossed his face. Lost her mother young. Ugly business. Never fully closed. Since then, she runs this house like a fortress, and herself like one too. You'll earn nothing from her by trying. You earn it by being unbreakable long enough that she stops waiting for you to break. I thought of Rosalind Draven's name in a report I had memorized before I could stop myself, of my father's name beside it in the same paragraph, blamed for a leak he never made. I said nothing. Some lies you tell with silence instead of words, and I had gotten very good at both. By noon, I had walked the grounds twice, mapped every sightline from the tree line to the seawall, and clocked 4 places a professional would choose to stage an approach if the threat tier Garrison quoted was real and not corporate paranoia dressed up in numbers. By 2 o'clock, Isolde Draven found me on the east terrace, checking the angle of a hedge that a marksman could use for cover, and she watched me for a long moment before she spoke. Most new hires spend their first day memorizing floor plans, she said. You're memorizing kill zones. Floor plans don't stop bullets. Something that wasn't quite a smile touched her mouth and vanished before I could be sure I'd seen it. No, she agreed. They don't. She looked out at the water, at the gray horizon stacked against a grayer sky, and for a moment the ice in her voice thinned into something almost human. My mother used to stand right here. Said the tide told her more about the business than any report ever did. She caught herself saying it, and the wall came back up so fast I almost missed the crack it left behind. That's not relevant to your job. No, I said, but I'll remember it anyway. She looked at me like I'd said something dangerous. Maybe I had. In my pocket, the compass sat heavy and stubborn, needle locked on a direction I no longer trusted, and somewhere under my ribs, a thing I'd buried 3 years ago stirred awake and did not go back to sleep. The gala at the Cordray Museum was supposed to be a formality. Donors, cameras, champagne poured for people who'd never worked a day they couldn't buy their way out of. Isolde wore black, the color of deep water, and when she stepped out of the car under the flashing lights, 300 phones lifted at once like a single organism deciding she was worth the storage space. I stayed 4 feet behind her left shoulder, counting exits the way I counted breaths, and I told myself the tight feeling in my chest was professional vigilance, and nothing more personal than that. Garrison had drilled the route with me twice. Main Hall, West Gallery, the terrace overlooking the harbor where the fundraising speech would happen at 9. I'd walked it a 3rd time alone that afternoon, memorizing sightlines from the surrounding rooftops, because that was what my father had taught me, and old habits don't care whether the paycheck under them is a lie. At 8:51, I saw the man on the east stairwell landing before anyone else in that room even registered he existed. Wrong jacket for the weather, wrong stillness for a guest. His eyes tracked Isolde across the room the way a hunter's eyes track something that doesn't yet know its prey, and his right hand sat too close to his hip for a man holding nothing but a drink he wasn't drinking. Move left, I said into Isolde's ear, low enough that only she heard it, my hand already at the small of her back, steering her behind a marble column before she'd finished turning to ask why. She didn't argue. Something in my voice must have told her arguing would cost her something she couldn't get back. The man came off the landing fast, a blade catching the chandelier light for half a second before I closed the distance and took the strike on my forearm instead of her throat. Pain went white and total up to my shoulder. I didn't feel it the way I would later, in the ambulance, in the weeks after. In that moment, there was only the count. 1, disarm. 2, control the wrist. 3, take him to the marble floor with a technique my father drilled into me before I was old enough to understand why a 9-year-old needed it. 4 seconds, I counted all of them. Security swarmed a heartbeat too late to matter. Isolde stood pressed against the column exactly where I'd put her, unhurt, her mother's rope of pearls rising and falling too fast at her throat, staring at me like I had just rewritten every assumption she'd built her armor out of. "You're bleeding," she said, and her voice, for the first time since I'd met her, cracked clean down the middle. "It's shallow." It wasn't. I could feel it soaking warm down to my wrist, and underneath the adrenaline I registered, distantly, that scent had flooded the space between us. Hers, vetiver and struck flint gone sharp with fear, and something in mine answering it, warm and unbidden, fig and clover honey turned electric with the aftermath of violence. She reached for my arm before Garrison could reach her, tearing a strip from the hem of her own gown, without a flicker of hesitation, wrapping the wound with hands that shook even as her voice stayed level. "Hold still," she said, and it wasn't a command this time. It was something closer to a plea. "I've had worse." "That is not," she said, tying the makeshift bandage tight enough to make me hiss, "the reassurance you think it is." Up close, for one unguarded second, I watched the Ice Duchess of Draven Cove look at me like I was something worth being frightened for, and I understood, with the sick clarity of a woman watching her own careful walls take their first real crack, that I had just made myself impossible to walk away from. They took the man in the wrong jacket into custody before midnight, and by morning the papers had already turned my 4 seconds into a headline: "The Bodyguard Who Bled for the Ice Duchess," printing a version of me that was somehow both more famous and less true than anything I'd ever been. Garrison promoted me to principal protection before the coffee finished brewing in the security office, his handshake firmer than the day I'd started, his eyes carrying a question he hadn't asked yet. Isolde didn't thank me in words. Instead, 3 days later, a jeweler's box arrived at the carriage house addressed to Miss Voss, and inside it sat my father's compass, cleaned, the housing repaired, a note in handwriting too controlled to belong to someone who didn't care. Whatever this points to, it read, "I hope you trust it again someday." I didn't tell her the needle had been stuck on the wrong bearing since the night my father died holding a woman who wasn't his to protect, on a pier 3 miles from a home I could never go back to. I didn't tell her that the compass had been his, that the man in the report blamed for that pier's failure had been him, that I had built an entire false name out of the wreckage of that single sentence in a file nobody was supposed to let me read. I told her thank you, and I meant it more than she could have known, and I hated myself a little more for every ounce of that meaning. The estate settled into a rhythm after the gala, early runs along the seawall with Isolde 2 paces behind me, insisting she could keep her own pace though her breath told a different story. Late nights reviewing threat assessments at a kitchen table that smelled like the coffee she made too strong and never apologized for. The particular quiet of a house learning, slowly, to let one more person all the way in. Mrs. Petrov, the housekeeper who had run that kitchen since before Isolde could walk, started leaving me a second cup without being asked. Garrison stopped double-checking my perimeter reports. Small things. The kind of things that build a life out of a lie, one honest gesture at a time, until the lie starts to feel like the only dishonest part left standing. "You favor your left side," Isolde said one evening. watching me clean a service weapon at the kitchen table with the particular economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times before. Old injury? Old habit? Both. Technically, I didn't elaborate. I had gotten good at answers that were true enough to survive a second question and vague enough to survive a third. You never talk about where you trained. She said it lightly, the way you toss a stone to see how deep the water runs. Garrison ran your file, says half of it reads like redactions someone forgot to actually redact. My hands didn't stop moving. That was the one thing about me that never betrayed anything. Some of what I did, I'm not allowed to talk about. That's what people say when they're either very important or very dishonest. She studied me over the rim of her coffee, gray eyes doing the thing they did, cataloging, deciding, filing. I haven't worked out which you are yet. Maybe I'm both. Something in her expression shifted, not quite a smile, closer to the ghost of one, gone before it could commit to existing. I don't like not knowing things, Marlo. My false name in her mouth had started to sound less like a lie and more like a name she'd chosen for me herself, which was, I would come to understand, so much worse. I've built an entire life on knowing things before other people decide to tell me. Then you already know I'm good at my job. That, she said, setting down her cup, was never the question I was asking. She left the kitchen before I could decide whether to answer the real one, and I sat alone with a stripped-down weapon and a compass in my pocket that had, for the first time in 3 years, started pointing somewhere I actually wanted to go. The summons came 9 days later, delivered not by Garrison, but by Isolde herself, standing in the doorway of the carriage house at an hour when principals didn't usually bother their protection detail. My cousin wants a meeting, she said, and something in the flatness of her voice told me this wasn't business as usual. Thane, neutral ground, his lawyers insisted. He's requested I bring minimal security. Her jaw tightened, a small, precise motion, the only outward sign that the request had cost her something to relay. I want you there, not minimal. You, Garrison, won't like that. Garrison doesn't run point on threats that matter to me personally. She held my gaze longer than the sentence required, and for the first time I understood that whatever she decided I was to her, it had stopped being purely professional some time in the last 9 days, quietly, without either of us marking the moment it happened. Thane murdered my mother's memory the day he contested her legacy in a courtroom instead of a eulogy. I don't trust neutral ground with him. I don't trust much of anything with him. A beat, softer than she probably intended. I trust you. The words landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there, warm and unwelcome, because I knew things about that pier and that report and the name Kane that she didn't, and trust built on half a person was still, in the end, a kind of theft. I'll be there, I said, and meant it as a promise, even as some older, more honest part of me understood it was also a countdown. Thane Draven met us in a glass-walled conference room on neutral ground that smelled faintly of cologne trying too hard, a man whose smile arrived a half second before his eyes agreed to it. He was handsome in the deliberate way expensive things are handsome, and when he looked at me, he looked a beat too long, the way a man looks at a puzzle piece he's trying to place. You must be the famous Miss Voss, he said, extending a hand I didn't take. The gala. Very impressive. 4 seconds, they're saying. His eyes flicked over my face with a precision that had nothing to do with charm. You have a familiar look about you, Miss Voss. Can't quite place it. I have one of those faces. He held my gaze a moment longer than was polite, then let it go, turning his attention to Isolde with the smooth, practiced warmth of a man performing family. Cousin, you look well. Grief becomes you, in its way. Say what you came to say, Thane. He spread his hands, magnanimous, wounded, every gesture rehearsed. The board vote is in 5 weeks. I only want what's fair. Our grandfather built this company on the principle that blood answers to blood. And yet here you are, guarded by strangers, running the company alone, refusing the family that built it. His eyes cut to me again, quick, assessing, and something behind them sharpened into a kind of recognition that made my pulse stutter. Strangers with very interesting ursums. My ursum isn't the subject of this meeting. No, he agreed, smiling the smile of a man who has already decided how a conversation will end before it starts. Not yet. We left that glass room with nothing resolved and something new hanging in the air between us, a thread pulled loose that I couldn't yet see the shape of. In the car, Isolde sat rigid, staring out at the passing gray water, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before. He's planning something. She said it the way you'd state a tide table, certain, immovable, I don't know what yet. But I know my cousin, and I know that smile. Her hand found the seat between us, not quite reaching for mine, close enough that the gesture meant something anyway. Whatever it is, I need you closer than I've let anyone get in 7 years. Is that a problem, Miss Voss? I looked at her, at the crack of fear under all that careful ice, and I thought of my father's voice telling me hesitation was the only sin a protector couldn't survive. No, I said. It isn't. The storm rolled in off the water 3 nights later, the kind that turned the estate's windows into drumskins and knocked the power out twice before finally holding steady on backup generators that hummed low under the wind. Garrison had pulled half the outdoor watch inside when the wind gusts hit 60, leaving the perimeter thinner than either of us liked. And I'd told him I'd take the extra rounds myself rather than leave gaps a professional could exploit. I was on my 3rd pass of the ground floor when the east motion sensor tripped, then went silent too fast for weather, and every instinct my father ever drilled into me came online at once. I found Isolde in the library, curled into the window seat with a book she wasn't reading, watching lightning fracture the sky over water that looked like it wanted to swallow the house whole. Sensor breach, east perimeter, I said, already moving to kill the lamp beside her. Could be a downed branch. Could not be. I need you away from the glass. She didn't argue, which told me more than anything how seriously she'd learned to take my instincts. We moved together into the interior hallway, and I had her behind me, back to the wall, weapon drawn and steady, when the backup generator cut out entirely, and the house dropped into a dark broken only by the storm's white flashes through the windows. Stay behind me, I said. Don't move, unless I move you. Marlo, I need you to trust me right now more than you've ever trusted anyone. A beat, in the dark, with the storm screaming outside and her breath too fast behind my shoulder. I do, she said, and something in the simplicity of it undid me more than the danger did. The intruder came through the service entrance 12 minutes later, a shape in tactical gear moving with training that told me immediately this wasn't opportunism. This was contracted. This was the same grade of professional who'd once walked a pier in the rain and left 2 people I loved behind me forever. I put myself between him and Isolde before he cleared the second hallway, and the fight that followed happened almost entirely in the dark, by feel and memory and 12 years of training I'd sworn I'd never use again, his blade catching my ribs before I broke his grip, the 2 of us slamming into an antique table that splintered under our combined weight. Until finally I had him face down with my knee between his shoulder blades and a zip tie cinched tight enough to make him swear. Garrison's team found us like that when the backup lighting finally kicked in, me bleeding from a shallow cut along my ribs, breathing hard. Isolde pressed against the wall exactly where I'd left her, staring at the restrained intruder with an expression I couldn't read in the strobing emergency light. He was waiting for the storm, Garrison said grimly, checking the man's gear. Professional kit. This wasn't random. His eyes found mine, sharp with a question he still hadn't voiced out loud. Wherever you trained, Voss, it's the only reason both of you are alive right now. Isolde crossed to me before the sentence finished, her hands finding the cut along my ribs with the same shaking precision she'd shown at the gala, and this time she didn't try to hide how frightened she'd been. You keep bleeding for me, she said, quiet, almost angry, the words trembling at the edges. Why do you keep bleeding for me? I looked at her in the strobing light, at the ice fully melted now, nothing left in her face, but a woman terrified of losing something she'd only just let herself want, and the truth sat right behind my teeth, close enough to taste. Because your mother died on a pier my father was blamed for. Because I came here to bury a name, and instead I found you. Because I think I love you, and I don't know how to say that without confessing everything else alongside it. Because it's my job, I said instead, and hated myself for the lie even as her hand found mine in the dark and held on like I was the only steady thing left in the storm. The days after the storm folded into something neither of us named out loud, but both of us understood. She stopped calling me Ms. Voss except in front of Garrison. I stopped pretending the ache in my chest when she smiled at me over morning coffee was anything but exactly what it was. We sat on the East Terrace one evening with the wound along my ribs still tender under its bandage, watching gulls work the tide line, and she told me, for the first time, about the pier. I was 23. Her voice had gone somewhere far away, somewhere I recognized because I lived there too. My mother was meeting a shipping contact at the marina. Routine, or it should have been. I wasn't there. I've spent 7 years being grateful I wasn't there and hating myself for it in equal measure. Her hands twisted together in her lap. The report said her security detail was compromised from the inside, said the lead protector leaked the schedule. A muscle worked in her jaw. I've never believed that part. He died trying to shield her. I read the coroner's account 100 times. A man who sells out his principal doesn't take 3 rounds standing between her and the shooter. Something cracked open in my chest, wide and sudden. Grief and vindication tangled together so tightly I couldn't have separated them if I'd tried. What was his name? I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. Emery Kane. She said it softly, like a name she still turned over sometimes in the dark. I looked into his daughter once, years ago, wanted to tell her the official story never sat right with me. I never found her. She'd vanished completely, changed her name, disappeared into nothing. She looked at me then, and for one unbearable second I thought she already knew that this was a test I was failing in real time. I hope, wherever she is, someone finally told her the truth doesn't always match the paperwork. I didn't tell her. God help me, sitting there with my father's blood debt finally spoken aloud by the one person who'd never believed the lie about him. I still didn't tell her. I reached for her hand instead, and she let me hold it, and the compass in my pocket sat warm against my hip, needle finally, unmistakably, pointing true. That night, storm long past, she found me on the terrace where I'd once mapped kill zones on my first afternoon in her world, and the space between us had gotten small enough that neither of us pretended otherwise anymore. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer honestly, because I have spent 7 years being lied to by people who wanted something from me, and I don't think I can survive it from you. Ask me. Is this real? Her eyes searched mine in the dark, stripped of every ounce of the ice the papers loved to write about. What's happening between us? Tell me it isn't gratitude or proximity or whatever a person feels towards someone who keeps saving her life. Tell me you feel it too, or tell me to stop, and I will. I feel it too. The truest sentence I'd given her since the day we met, and it cost me everything I had left to say it, and nothing else. I have since the lobby. Since before I understood what it was. She closed the distance between us slowly, giving me every chance to step back, to say the word that would end it before it started. Ask me with your words, I told her, because some rules I would never break even here, even now, even wrapped in every other lie I was still telling her. Tell me what you want. I want you to kiss me, she said, low and certain, and I want you to stop pretending you don't want the same thing. I didn't stop pretending about everything, but I stopped pretending about that, and when I kissed her, the scent between us went warm and electric and entirely unguarded. Vetiver and struck flint tangled through fig and clover honey, and for one perfect, borrowed hour I let myself believe that a woman could bury her whole self and still be loved for what was left standing. Vane's smear campaign broke 3 weeks later, timed with a precision that told me exactly how long he'd been sitting on it. It started as a single leaked document to a business journal, an old personnel file, redacted everywhere except the parts designed to wound, revealing that Isolde Draven's new head of personal security had testified under a different name in a closed hearing 7 years prior, in connection with the same peer incident that killed the CEO's own mother. By evening, it was a headline. By morning, it was every headline. My photograph from the gala sitting beside a photograph of my father in dress uniform. The caption asking questions dressed up as facts. The bodyguard's secret. The traitor's daughter, guarding the family her father betrayed. Garrison found me in the security office, staring at a screen I couldn't make myself turn off. Is it true? He said, and it wasn't really a question. Emery Kane was my father. My voice came out steady, even though nothing else in me was. The report that blamed him for the leak was wrong. He died protecting her. I know that better than anyone alive, because I was the one who identified his body. I made myself meet Garrison's eyes. I never lied about my skill. I lied about my name, because the name Kane couldn't get hired to guard a houseplant after that report, let alone a Draven. Something moved behind his expression, not quite forgiveness, not quite condemnation, something more complicated sitting in between. She's going to want to hear that from you, he said, not from a headline. He was already too late. Isolde stood in the doorway, phone in hand, the article open on the screen, her face doing something I'd never seen it do before. Not the ice, not the fear from the storm, something colder and more final. A door closing that I'd spent weeks convincing myself would never shut against me. Kane, she said, testing the shape of my real name like it might cut her mouth. Emery Kane's daughter, sitting in my house, sleeping down the hall from me, kissing me on a terrace where my mother used to stand. Her voice cracked on the last word and then hardened immediately, ice sealing back over the crack faster than I'd ever seen it form. How long were you going to let me find out? Isolde, don't. One word, flat, final, more devastating than shouting could have managed. I told you I couldn't survive being lied to. I told you that. And you let me say it to your face, and you still said nothing. Her eyes glistened, furious and betrayed in equal measure. Every instinct I had said not to trust anyone in this business, and the one time I let myself be wrong about that, it turns out I wasn't wrong at all. I never lied about how I feel about you. You lied about who you are. Her voice had gone very quiet, which was somehow worse than the fury. I don't know how to separate those two things, Marlo, or Kane, or whoever you actually are underneath all of it. She stepped back from me like the distance itself was a wound she needed. Garrison, reassign her, effective immediately. I want a full security review of everything she's touched since day one. Isolde, I would never. I don't know what you would or wouldn't do. The words landed like stones. That's rather the problem, isn't it? She turned and walked away before I could find a sentence big enough to hold everything I hadn't said in time, and I stood in that office with my father's ruined name splashed across every screen in the room, understanding, too late, that the truth I'd been protecting her from all along had been mine to give her freely, and I had chosen silence instead, right up until the moment silence stopped being a choice at all. Nadia let me sleep on her couch for 4 nights before she finally sat across from me with 2 mugs of coffee neither of us drank and said what needed saying. "You have to fight this," she said, "not for the job. For your father. For you." She slid a folder across the table, one I hadn't seen in 3 years, one I'd been too afraid to open since the hearing that ended my old life. "You kept his effects. You told me once there was a partner assigned to the same detail. Declan something. Marsh, the name tasted like ash. He testified against my father. Said Dad flagged the schedule change to an outside contact the morning of the peer meeting. Did you ever find out who the outside contact was supposed to be?" I hadn't. 3 years of grief and shame had kept me from asking the one question that might have unraveled everything, and sitting in Nadia's kitchen with my father's file spread across the table, I finally let myself ask it. It took 2 days of calls to old contacts who still owed my father favors, 2 days of digging through financial records a forensic accountant friend of Nadia's helped me decode. Before the pattern surfaced with a clarity that turned my stomach, Declan Marsh had received 3 payments in the 6 months before the peer incident, routed through shell accounts that traced, after 4 more careful layers, to a holding company controlled by a 24-year-old heir named Thane Draven. My father hadn't leaked anything. He'd been set up by his own partner, paid to open a door that got 2 people killed, and then made to disappear behind a story that let the real architect inherit everything he wanted 7 years later, on schedule, right on time for a board vote that would finally hand him the company he'd been buying his way toward since before I was old enough to understand what I'd lost. I called Garrison first. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, his voice came out rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "Get me everything you have," he said. "And Marlo, that's the first time I've heard you use your own name out loud. Suits you better than the other one did." Thane made his move 2 nights before the board vote, exactly as Isolde had predicted he would, except he was smarter and crueler than either of us had allowed for. He didn't come himself. He sent Declan Marsh, the man who had already killed once for him, and clearly intended to close the account completely this time, straight through a service entrance Garrison's reduced detail hadn't fully covered since my reassignment left a gap in coverage nobody else had thought to fill. I wasn't supposed to be on the estate that night. I came anyway, because some instincts don't care what your employment status says, and because Nadia's forensic accountant had just confirmed the last shell account link an hour earlier, and I couldn't sit still with proof like that in my hands, and Isolde unprotected on the other side of the city. I found them in the library, the same room where the storm had once driven us together. Declan Marsh with a blade to Isolde's throat, and Thane standing in the doorway watching with the calm, satisfied expression of a man who believed he had already won. "Miss Kane," Thane said, unsurprised, almost pleased. "I did wonder if you'd come running once the story broke. Sentiment, it's such a reliable weakness." He nodded to Marsh. Finish it. Then we'll discuss what story explains 2 more bodies on this estate. Marsh, I said, keeping my voice level even as every part of me screamed to move, you sold my father out for 3 payments and a promotion that never came. You've been running from that debt for 7 years. Thane's not going to let you outlive tonight either. You're a loose end to him. You've always been a loose end. Something flickered behind Marsh's eyes, doubt finding a crack it hadn't had room for in years, and in the half-second his grip loosened, Isolde drove her elbow back into his ribs, with a precision I hadn't taught her, but recognized instantly as something she'd absorbed anyway. Weeks of watching me, weeks of learning the only language I'd ever been fully honest in. I closed the distance and took Marsh down clean, disarming him before Thane's shock had fully registered, and when Thane lunged for the blade Marsh dropped, Isolde stepped into the space between us the way I had once stepped into the space for her, taking the shallow slash meant for my ribs across her own forearm instead. Now we're even, she said through gritted teeth, blood welling bright against her sleeve, and even furious, even betrayed, even mid-fight for both our lives. Something in her eyes when she looked at me said she'd meant more by that than the wound. I had Thane on the floor in under 10 seconds, his own cousin's fury lending Isolde's restrained fury a weight that made him go still beneath us both. And for one terrible moment I saw murder sitting plain and unguarded in her eyes, 7 years of grief finally close enough to touch. Isolde, my voice came out steady, gentling, don't. He's not worth what it costs you to cross that line. Let the truth do it instead. Let him lose everything in front of everyone who ever called your father's daughter cold for not trusting him. That's a worse ending for a man like him than anything either of us could do with our hands. She held my gaze, breathing hard, blood dripping steady from her forearm, and slowly, deliberately, she stepped back. Call the police, she said. And garrison. Now, the board convened an emergency session 4 days later, and Isolde walked into that glass-walled room with her arms still bandaged and her spine perfectly straight, playing the recorded confession Marsh had given in exchange for a lighter sentence, laying out the financial trail Nadia's accountant and I had spent 2 sleepless days assembling, letter by letter, account by account. Until every director in that room understood exactly what Thane Draven had built his ambitions on top of. Security escorted him out under arrest before the vote was even called, his composure finally, completely gone, shouting accusations that landed on no one because the paperwork behind him told a truer story than his voice ever could. Isolde stood at the head of that table afterward and did something I hadn't expected. She read my father's name into the official record herself, correcting 7 years of institutional lie with a public statement that named Emery Kane's true role on the night he died, restoring, in front of the same board that had once quietly accepted the false version. The only inheritance that had ever mattered to me. Afterward, in the corridor outside the boardroom, she found me waiting, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. 7 years of grief and 3 weeks of betrayal, and something warmer sitting underneath both of them, all crowded into the space between us. I should have told you everything the day you told me about your mother, I said. I let fear decide for me instead of trust. I'm sorry doesn't undo that. I know it doesn't. No, she agreed. It doesn't. Her eyes were steady on mine, grief and forgiveness tangled together in a way that looked, for the first time since the headlines broke, like something that might survive. But you came back for me anyway. You didn't have to. I'd fired you. I'd humiliated you in front of my own security team, and you still walked into that room for me. I told you once. I don't flinch. You never have. Her hand found my uninjured arm, steady, deliberate. I've spent 7 years building walls so no one could ever get close enough to lie to me the way the world lied about my mother's death. And then you came in and told me the truth was worse and better than either of us knew, and somehow that's what finally let me trust someone completely for the first time since I was 23 years old." Her voice dropped, quiet, certain. "Tell me to stop, and I will." "But I don't want to stop, Marlowe Kane. I want all of it. Your real name, your real history, whatever's left after 7 years of both of us burying people we loved." "Ask me with your words," I said, my own voice breaking on the words I'd used so carefully as armor for so long. "Stay," she said, "not as my bodyguard, as mine." I kissed her in that corridor with my father's name finally, fully restored between us, and when she pulled back just far enough to press her forehead to mine, I felt her hand find my throat, gentle, questioning. An unspoken ask sitting behind her fingertips. "Tell me to stop," she whispered, "and I will." "Don't stop," I said, and when her teeth found the joint of my neck and shoulder a moment later, the bond settled into place like a compass needle finally landing true north, warm and certain and entirely, permanently mine. 6 months later, the estate smelled like salt air and cut roses instead of gunmetal and rain. Isolde stood on the east terrace where her mother once read the tide, dressed simply, her hair loose for once instead of pinned to attention, and she went down on one knee in front of the whole household staff and Garrison, who was doing a poor job pretending he wasn't crying, and Nadia, who wasn't pretending at all. She opened a small box holding a ring set with a stone the exact gray of a November coastline. "I have run an empire since I was 23 years old," she said, "and I have never once been afraid of a decision until this one, because this is the only decision I've ever made where losing feels like the only real danger left in my life." Marlowe Kane. Stay with me, not because I need protecting, because I choose you, every day, on purpose, the way you chose the truth even after I made it, cost you everything. We married in autumn, on the same terrace, small and warm and entirely ours, with Rosalind Draven's favorite piece playing softly on a restored piano that Isolde had kept silent for 7 years, and finally, that morning, asked Mrs. Petrov to tune. Garrison walked me down the makeshift aisle because I had no father left to do it, and at the reception he pulled me aside long enough to say, gruffly, that in 11 years of running that household security, he'd never once seen his principal wait for anyone the way she'd waited, hoping for me to finally tell her the truth. Nadia cried through the entire ceremony and blamed the wind. Declan Marsh's testimony, alongside the recovered financial trail, put Thane Draven away for conspiracy and attempted murder in a trial that closed. At last, the file on a pier I could finally stop returning to in my sleep. A year on, we stood in that same library, morning light pouring gold across the floor, where a blade had once found Isolde's arm, and she pressed my father's compass into my palm, its glass replaced, its needle finally true, steady on north the way it had been the whole time I'd simply been too afraid to trust it. On the windowsill behind her sat the whistle I'd carried since childhood, 3 sharp notes my father once used to call me home from the far end of a field, and somewhere down the hall I could hear Isolde humming that same 3-note call to the small, fierce, gray-eyed child asleep in the next room, the one who already reached for my hand before she reached for anyone else's, the one Isolde swore, laughing, had inherited my instinct for finding every exit in a room before she'd even learned to walk. I had buried myself once to survive a truth that wasn't mine to carry alone. It took a woman cold enough to be called ice by strangers, and warm enough to thaw 7 years of my grief, with nothing but the truth spoken kindly, to teach me that being fully known was never the danger I'd trained myself to guard against. It was, all along, the only home worth finding. The end. If a story about finally being seen for exactly who you are, scars and secrets included, found its way to you tonight, I hope it landed somewhere true. Subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you too. And I'd love to know, if you were Marlowe, standing in that corridor with your real name finally out in the open, would you have told Isolde the truth sooner, or protected her from it the way she'd protect anyone she loved? Tell me in the comments. Until the next story, sleep well and stay close to whoever makes you feel safe enough to stop hiding.